Today we have a tale from pioneer days of the late 18th century in what's now Southwest Virginia, then part of the Appalachian frontier. Hello folks, I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia.
You know, Steve, it's always great to hear these tales from pioneer days from Southwest Virginia, Northeast Tennessee, Western North Carolina, even Southeastern Kentucky, and, West Virginia. Of course, West Virginia and Kentucky at that point were all a part of Virginia, all that together. But, it's always great to hear these stories. But, there was a mystery about the unknown, I guess, so to speak, when they were going out and moving further west and coming out toward, the Gap and Cumberland Gap and some of these places. There were unknowns that were out there, and I'm sure people's minds wondered as to what was going on with, certain tales and certain people.
Well, all kinds of mysteries abounded in these mountains back then, and this is a story of one of those that actually still is told a little bit. Not this particular story, but one of the subjects in this story is talked about to this day. So a little bit of history, a little bit of folklore, and hopefully a very nice story for you. Well, at one time, the mountains of this area were awash with long hunters, collecting hides for sale and shipment back to England, a lucrative trade at the time. And these men were the first wave of later English settlement in Appalachia, and our tale today involves one of those folks. Now, this man, whose name was Joash, was a long hunter who'd come out of North Carolina, wandering up and over the peaks and valleys of Appalachia looking for game. And when he found a good spot, Joash would set up camp and stay in the area till he gathered up enough furs and hides to make the trip back to the settlements in North Carolina worthwhile. And on one such trip, Rod, he took his son along, planning to teach the young man the skills of mountain hunting and living. The two of them found a suitable site near a big spring, and there they built a small cabin. There was plenty of game, and the hunting was great. And that season was one of the best they'd ever had.
Well, Steve, no other people were in the region at that time, and the two had all that hunting and trapping to themselves. So they had no need to lock their cabin door. They simply pulled the door shut and left the cabin and their supplies and furs alone for days on end as they followed the game trails through the mountains. The cabin was always undisturbed until one fall day. On that day, they returned to the cabin to find its contents ripped apart and scattered about. Their food stores had been broken into with dried meat pulled down from where it had been hanging and was taken away. Some of the furs had also been ripped apart too. Joash was puzzled. He wondered what in the world could have done this. The only explanation that the two could come up with was that it must have been someone, well, really not someone, but something, maybe like a big black bear. That worried the two men, concerned that it might come back, so they decided the best course of action was to take turns going out into the woods to hunt with one of the men, staying behind at the cabin to protect it at all times.
Well, one day after the hunt, the son came home to find his father agitated. Joash told him he'd heard something horrible outside in the woods, a creature that made this weird, wailing cry all around the cabin. It was an eerie sound, part human and part beast. Well, Joash had never heard such a strange sound before, not in all his years as a long hunter in these mountains, going all the way from North Carolina up to the Ohio River. No matter what he did, he never did spot whatever it was that was making all that unearthly noise out in the woods. Well, this spooked the two, father and son, very badly, and they were now fearful of going out into the wilderness around the cabin. As a result, they both stayed close to home, refusing to leave the safety of the cabin and its immediate vicinity. Well, this lasted about a week, and during that time those strange sounds failed to return. So the two thought about it and decided that, well, maybe whatever it was that was out in the woods that day was gone. So the two returned to taking turns hunting and guarding the cabin.
Well, they kept this up all through the fall and even into the winter. They hunted and trapped animals for meat and for furs and hides until they had made, well, enough to make that trip back to North Carolina, and they'd made it all worth it. That spring, as they finished packing their catch of furs for the trip back home, the son decided he'd go out into the woods to shoot some squirrels for breakfast down at a stand of hickory trees that was full of the furry animals. The son went on down there, leaving Joash to finish packing for their long trip. Well, after catching 6 squirrels, the son headed back up to the cabin. Just as he and his catch got within sight of the cabin, he caught sight of a strange, hairy, naked man running off into the woods, carrying something that looked familiar. He looked closer and noticed what this thing was carrying was his father's head.
Well, the young man fell to his knee, grabbing his rifle, and he took careful aim at the figure and fired. The shot met its mark, and the hairy man fell, instantly dead. As the young man ran toward the creature, he almost tripped over something. He looked down, only to see in horror his father's bloody leg ripped out of its socket at the hip. Whatever had done that was powerful, more powerful than any bear or any other creature that lived in these mountains. Farther along, he found the twisted remains of Joash's body. Then he found the dead beast. Well, the young man buried his father near the cabin, and after that he dragged the body of that hairy man to a nearby ditch and covered it up with dirt and rocks. When he got a closer look at the beast, he found it to be taller than any man he'd ever seen, probably 7 or 8 feet tall. It was also in very good shape, too, being muscular with a thick chest and very large feet, too large for any moccasins to fit. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal, certainly not an Indian or any other human being for that matter.
Shocked as he was at the day's tragic events and with a heavy heart at the loss of his father, the young man thought it would be best to wait another day and start out for home at first light the next day. All that had happened that day was nothing compared to what awaited him when darkness fell. That night he tried to get some sleep, but he wasn't able to, not just because of the loss of his father, but also because those strange, wailing sounds had returned. All night he was kept awake by those unearthly shrieks that pierced the air. This kept up for about an hour, or hours or upon hours, I should say, all night long. He went out at first light and found that the hairy man had been removed from his grave in the ditch sometime in the night and carried away. This terrified the young man, so he quickly packed up the rest of his belongings and headed out of that horrible place and hightailed it back to the settlements back in North Carolina, vowing to never return to that cursed place above the most beautiful valley that would later be named for a member of Dr. Thomas Walker's expedition to the Cumberland Gap, Powell Valley.
And that place where the cabin sat? Well, it was named for that slain father, Joash Cracker, now known as Cracker's Neck. And the hairy man? Well, you've likely heard of him by another name, for there's a statue of him on High Knob in Norton, the Wood Booger.
Now, my question is, Steve, I wonder if the people that put up the Wood Booger statue there on High Knob knew this story to begin with, because I was under the understanding that the Wood Booger Bigfoot statue that's at High Knob was placed up there probably because of the reference to being on television, I think, with Animal Planet or something, along with those people that have that Bigfoot expedition thing.
Right.
But, this is the first time I've heard this story.
Well, this is one of those early stories of a wood booger-like creature, and I'm just, saying it's got to be the wood booger, and sort of a tale of how Cracker's Neck came to have its name that I had run across a couple of years ago. Did a little digging and searching on that, and I don't know if folks up in that area have ever heard this story, but supposedly this is one of the tales that has been told to tell how Cracker's Neck got its name, and about that hairy man, which I would assume would be the wood booger. And folks, that's the tale of the first encounter between man and wood booger in the mountains above Powell Valley. Another bit of the history and the folklore of this place we call home. Thanks for listening. Hey, you can subscribe to the Stories Podcast at Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Spotify, Odyssey, Audible, Stitcher, Good Pods, or on your favorite podcast app. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.